Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. I'm Dale Stenberg, and I'm joined once again by my faithful co-host, Dr. Joseph Minich, and I'll introduce our guest in just a minute. As most of you know, Joe and I have an ongoing series wherein we discuss the various themes found throughout the works of C.S. Lewis. We've also talked about the phenomenon of archetypal patterns found in myth and fairy tales and fantasy for the purpose of showing the continuity of thought that is common to the human imagination. In our conversations, we've been treating the Son of God as both the source and sense maker of these patterns, and he took them upon himself in concrete history. But how do we bridge the gap between the specific of the hero's journey, for instance, found in these stories, and link them explicitly to Christ? Couldn't a Hindu or a Muslim or a Buddhist claim that these patterns come to life in their own traditions? Or alternatively, perhaps there are other ways to frame the relationship between myth, story, literature, and the Christian claims. Well, joining us for today's show is our dear friend, Dr. Owen Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University, and he's also the visiting scholar at Phoenix Seminary. He has written and lectured extensively on subjects such as epistemology, the liberal arts, philosophy, and theology. He joins us today to grapple with the question of how we can effectively use art in general and literature in particular as a means of introducing the Christian claims about reality, both to believers and non-believers alike. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us, brother.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you both. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yes. So since Joe and I have done several episodes thinking through some of the fiction of C.S. Lewis, perhaps it'd be appropriate to begin our conversation with how he viewed the role of imagination in apprehending Christian claims, and then we can talk about what you think is a wise use of art in the proverbial apologetic tool belt of Christians.
Yeah.
So Lewis viewed man as being composed of sort of three layers, and these three layers, they move out in concentric circles. For Lewis, at the bottom of man was his reason. And moving out from the reason was the will, and then moving out from the will is the imagination. Now, while all three of these aspects of man can be targeted by Christian engagement, Lewis believed that it was this surface layer of imagination that was the easiest layer to penetrate in order to introduce the schema of Christian thought via story. We see this attempt to accomplish that task in works such as the Narnia series and Till We Have Faces, the Ransom trilogy, just to name a few. So perhaps a good way to start out our conversation, Dr. Anderson, would be to ask, what do you think are some of the erroneous ways of framing the relationship between literature and Christian doctrine? And perhaps you could then tell us where you think Lewis's approach fits onto that map.
Yeah, good question. I think, because in our context, we're coming at this in the context of Christianity. And Lewis is held in high esteem. And I've appreciated Lewis, grew up reading him, started with Narnia and built into grew up into the sci-fi and then the apologetic works. So I want to be careful, because anytime you suggest maybe Lewis could have done something else, someone says, well, why do you hate Lewis? Right. So no, there's only appreciation for C.S. Lewis, no doubt about that. But there's still room to critically think about some of the ways he approached these topics. So that's what I'm doing. And same with Tolkien. We could treat those as slightly different, but overlapping in some ways. Because interesting, I think Tolkien's own view of what he's doing and the dislike of metaphor, direct metaphor of Christianity might be more similar to what I'm suggesting. So yeah, a couple things. Think about what we just said about reason, will, and then imagination. I think the way that reason's being developed in Lewis there, maybe we could call it mathematical reasoning or calculating reasoning. Because it's the idea that you could use reason positively or negatively. And in the Ransom series, for example, the bad guys are very good at calculating, using reason as a calculating force, but they don't have imagination. I would think of reason differently. Imagination and calculation are two of the uses of reason, But reason is the laws of thought by which we understand anything. So if we're doing mathematical calculations or we're doing imagination, we're using reason to form those things. So just at the beginning, setting that out so we don't run into definitional problems later on. Now, the way you set up Lewis and the life of imagination remind me of Plato and his conflict with the artists. So he had a very similar view about what art can do, but he saw the negative side of it and wanted to ban artists, right, from the Republic. Art can be used to tap into people's imagination, bypassing their understanding, and then manipulate them. And because of that kind of thing shouldn't be allowed in his Republic. Whereas Lewis might say the other side, the easiest way to teach people is with these kinds of stories and use the imagination. Now, I think we could say it could go both ways. You can see where it could go one way or the other, right? But I think it's all going to depend on what you're teaching. So what framework are you coming out of, and what are you teaching the people? And I think there's also a threat that you're thinking of the people perhaps too simple, and they can do more than we're giving them credit for. So they don't just have to have stories; they can actually learn more. But what do you think so far?
Yeah, I think one way of, I think your distinction is right on that we need to be, the question then is a sort of like in what way is Lewis kind of isolating something like reason from will in the imagination? And you're probably correct that in as much as we're making that kind of trifecta, if you will, that's probably a kind of particular way of using the notion of reason, because the whatever targets the imagination contains at least some implicit reasoning inside of it. In other words, there's a sense-making sort of laws.
You're distinguishing things like hobbits are hobbits and they're not non-hobbits.
Yeah.
There's Gandalf is Gandalf. He's not Sauron. You're distinguishing.
Yeah. So there's an implicit use of these tools, pre-discursively, if you will, in the imaginative sphere. But maybe what it does, maybe one way of framing it would be to say that one role of imagination pedagogically is to sort of to create a kind of new plausibility space. It's to sort of fracture your sort of the ways in which you use categories in a performative way, almost to sort of like think of reality this way and now re-ask this question. Yeah. And so I think part of what Lewis is trying to do is sort of get you to enter a sort of mental space where you can kind of take your will and that sort of discursive, more explicit level of reasoning and say, does this fit with these tools, right, these more explicit tools?
It presses you to ask new questions.
Sure. Yeah. And it framed, like Joe was talking about, it frames in a different way. I just finished up Michael Ward's fantastic and fascinating book, Planet Narnia. And at the end of the book, he's dealing with questions of reception of the book and sort of why Lewis wrote it. And one of the theories is that when Lewis wrote Miracles, which is his first foray into philosophy and apologetics, he was sort of, well, depends on who you ask, I suppose, but embarrassed when at the Socratic Society in England, he had a debate, and I always forget the woman's name. What's the woman's name?
Elizabeth
Anscombe.
Abscombe.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, where she punched a pretty significant hole in one of his primary theses, and then he immediately after that he wrote Narnia. And some people are like, well, that's because he was retreating back to his childhood. He felt so infantile, and he'd had to recoup, and he was like the little boy embarrassed about not being able to live up to daddy's ideal or whatever. But what Ward says is no, what that did for Lewis was it showed him that this technical approach to philosophy perhaps wasn't the best way to go about it. And so Lewis then tries to tap into the imagination as a means through which it's not a direct sort of like you were talking about math and algebra, and that's a very logical way to utilize reason. But what he thinks Lewis is doing is he thinks Lewis is trying to introduce the ideas of the Christian claim via a more colorful expression of what Christianity is by storytelling. And that's what I think Lewis has in mind when he uses the word imagination, like Joe is saying, this sort of discursive relationship between reason and imagination. So,
and let's say there is that way, like if you try to reduce all of life to logic. So he was encountering what might be called analytic philosophers,
right?
And if you try to reduce all of life to that, it turns out not to capture all of reality. There is the artistic side of reality, so we can affirm that, but it still comes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is it's going to depend on what your content is going in, and so we can examine some of that in Lewis and see where he's at. That's why I do a Tolkien. Like I think Tolkien, the world of Middle Earth is structured like the Gnostic world, and what I mean by that is not Gnosticism purely in terms of spirit and matter, but in terms of a hierarchy of beings where you mostly have contact with incarnate angels, and they're the ones battling out in our world. And the deity who formed the world is more like the demiurge, and he's distant, he's gone. You're dealing with Gandalf, who's incarnate, and Sauron, who's trying to become incarnate. Well, that's not theism, right? So that's what I want to look at is the content of what the artist is trying to get across. So maybe what we could do is this: let's look at art and try to see what is definition of art. Why does it matter? Because I think sometimes Christians get critiqued for their attempts at art because it comes across either as kind of sentimental or heavy-handed preaching, and it just Christians don't seem to understand art. What's going on? And I think what that's going to do is push us into understanding general revelation. And unfortunately, I think that Christians may not understand art real well because they don't do a lot of work in general revelation. And there could be a few reasons for that. One might be that it seems like general revelation means Darwin and Marx, and we have to be afraid of those guys because they're, general revelation must be false because they're doing general revelation. And the other reason might be, well, I'm saved. I accepted Jesus. I don't really need general revelation. What does that do? It just adds more things to study. So it could be a few reasons we could explore. Why isn't general revelation neglected by Christians? I think here's what I'll put out there for definition of art. Tell me what you think. Art is where we're using symbols to get to reality. So one sentence.
Yeah, it's not bad. That's a good. Yeah, if nothing, it certainly gestures in the right direction. It seems.
So if someone comes to art and expects a philosophical discourse, they're going to be disappointed.
Sure. Yeah.
And this will get to some of the points I was raising about using apologetic uses of art. If someone tries to jump too far with art and say to go beyond what it's symbolizing and try to say the gospel in the Mona Lisa, say, well, you've gone too far here. You're not capturing the symbolism of the art. So it also protects against the idea that art is only realism. Art can be realism, but it's not only realism. There are other symbolic forms of art that aren't directly pictures of reality, because you might think Anderson seems to not like fantasy. He must like only Dickens or something. There's room for symbolism in that sense, not realism, but it all comes back to what's being symbolized. Is the artist getting to reality or not? So I told you I'm going to write a fictional story about a tribe of square circles.
What you say about Christianity and art, I think, is crucial because, of course, I think most of us in this room, I don't know the age of everyone explicitly, but most of us were probably raised in the late 80s or early 90s or something like this. And Christian art was an interesting phenomenon, when you're being raised, it's whether it be Christian music or Christian film, and you still see some of these tendencies in sort of big Eva Christian circles where you begin to think in terms of things like I'm a Christian artist or I'm a Christian musician.
It's only like direct representation of the Christian life.
And unfortunately, the critique of that is often just somewhat, sort of evidentialist or almost scientific. Why is it that everything that's prefaced with the word Christian very often, by and large, is bad? But some of it was like and there's a story there's books to be written about this still, but people are already talking about, there's these books on the commercialization of sort of hippie vibes in the 70s. It's sort of like there was this hippie movement, and then by the 70s and early 80s, you get the commercialization of all that. And similarly, you see that in the Christian movement, that there's something part of what makes it bad art, honestly, is that it's very commercially driven art. Interestingly, it's just kind of filling a market for a certain kind of evangelical consumption, which doesn't tend to be the animus behind excellent statements.
Well, but that does, like, even now, let's say with secular art, almost all of it that I encounter is political. So it's the same kind of branch. Like, you're not doing art to do art. You're doing art to make a point.
Yes.
To your audience. Your audience is supposed to see your art and vote Democrat from now on.
Right.
And that's not art either.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
And one thing I think you mentioned earlier with Plato and the artists, and I want to connect this to something you just said with your definition of art being a symbol of reality.
Symbolism to get to reality. Yeah, not direct. Like if I say my shirt is blue, that's just a direct statement.
Right.
And philosophy, that's what philosophy does.
Sure.
Right? The artist isn't going to do that. The artist is going to teach something through what's called the objective correlative. There are certain natural signs. Like if you see a maple leaf that's brown, you have the natural sign of autumn and the end of a cycle, the beginning of winter and loss. All these things come to mind. Just it's very indirect. The artist doesn't have to tell you that stuff. Or you see an empty doorway where there used to be a child. The artist doesn't have to tell you what happened. You have the sense of emptiness and loss. So there's objective signs like that the artist uses, and the philosopher doesn't do that, or the mathematician doesn't do that. So protecting art means understanding that's what it's going to do. You can't reduce art to philosophy or math, and you can't reduce those to this. Right. But it's only going to be as good as far as the artist is getting us to reality. And interestingly, we'll come back to this if you want, but the artist may not even know it. That's what's interesting about art. Philosophy is different. To do good philosophy, you have to know you're doing it. The artist, this is why the Greeks would say he's taken over by the muse. And Homer prays to the muse at the beginning of the Iliad. And we have that sense still, right? Where artists might think they have to use drugs or something beforehand.
Yeah.
Because Socrates encountered this in the Apology. He said he went to three groups: the politicians, the artists, and the tradesmen. And the artists were the least able to explain their own work. Anybody else could explain their work better than them because they just kind of do their work. So I'm not necessarily getting at that the artist, he's sometimes the last person you can ask. I don't know. For me, it happens when I see a movie, I really liked it, and then I watch the end of credit stuff where they interview the actors. They're so disappointed. Like, you didn't get it at all. Like, you lived this movie for 9 months.
I was just a great example of this. Is I was just maybe a year and a half ago, I read through N.K. Jemisin wrote this trilogy, a sort of sci-fi trilogy called the Broken Earth trilogy, or the Fifth Season trilogy. I'm misremembering the name of it, but she's the first person in history, African-American woman, to win the Hugo Award 3 consecutive years in a row. Nobody's ever done this for each book of her trilogy. And at a descriptive level of a kind of non-earth setting, but sort of system of oppression, as a sort of phenomenology of the psychology of oppression, it was absolutely amazing. I mean, it's actually a remarkable piece of the sort of internal world of a system of oppression.
Yeah, and that's what that life imagination can do for us.
Yes, and but when the author, sort of like what you just said, when the author, Jemisin herself, actually gets in front of a microphone, she often will talk politically in the language of sort of critical theory language about oppression, and it's so much less illuminating. It's so interesting. Like in the author's own head, this phenomenology of oppression in the narrative and this theory actually go together, and to me, they don't go together.
Yeah.
and so on the one hand, I'm appreciating the author's work, but disagreeing with.
Well, that's how it is. Yeah. I mean. Yeah, so the idea, in other words, art becomes something independent of its creator. So you could, the artist may be the last person to ask, to say, well, what does this really mean? That's called author's intent. And it's kind of interesting to get author's intent, but it may not matter. Like, the artists themselves become, once they produce their art, they become one of us thinking about what they produced. And so author's intent only goes so far. It's more like anybody else saying, yeah, this is what I thought about when I did it. And we could say, wow, that's it. You don't get it either.
Yeah.
But what happens is, if the author is trying to get across a point, and this comes to the first things you were saying about Lewis, if you are trying to teach something, then it is going to be shaped by how well that message is formed. And then you're getting more into like a moral tale or like a Aesop's fable. You're getting more into that realm, not as much in art anymore.
So how would just a lay reader go about trying to distinguish well, I guess if we're saying that the authorial intent is not the sort of dominant thing that needs to be in the front of our mind when we're encountering a piece of art or in trying to interpret the piece of art, but some author's intention is trying to push the audience in one moral direction. How do we distinguish those two pieces of art? And then how can Christians sort of co-opt that? Maybe co-op's the wrong word, but how could Christians understand that piece of literature or art or whatever it is, and then say this points to these overarching archetypal structure patterns in reality that point to a uniformity that lends credence to the claims of Christianity? I guess that's really what we're trying to.
Yeah, that's what we want to get at. So two things there, and underneath this idea of how can Christians learn to appreciate and interpret art, right? I think the older phrase would have been rather than being Philistine, right? So the Philistines don't get art, and the others do. So, and not making everything commercial, right? Or a heavy-handed lesson, like a moral lesson. As soon as you can see that coming, right? As soon as it's a moral lesson, it's like, all right, here we go. This is different than art.
Yep. We've all watched a Kendrick Brothers movie, probably.
Yes. Yeah, and you feel like you want to support it because you understand, like, they have good intentions in one sense.
Yes.
But as long as you say it what it is. I mean, this is what it is, and maybe it's good.
But it's 25 distinct moral lessons in the space of 90 minutes. Exactly.
Yeah, and you can say there's a place for that, moral teachings, but it's not the same as art, is all we could say. And so the Christian, just like I was mentioning, maybe a secular artist might want you to see this and conclude critical theory is true. But the Christian's in the same position. If a Christian's doing something and wants you to include the Gospel of Matthew's true, well, that's the same thing, right? And so in the same way, they're not quite getting to art. And so then that brings up your idea, well, what about how do we get the Christians to appreciate? And this is one of the things I do at Phoenix Seminary is I have a reading group, a Great Books reading group, which is not for credit, but a number of the persons who are pursuing the MDiv, I approach it the same way as you would Scripture. Like, how do we interpret Scripture? Well, how do we interpret art? A pastor needs to know how to interpret art. So, I mean, the first thing would be, you asked about the layman, get a hold of a piece of literature, since we're talking about literature especially, that's reputed to be a great book. Maybe start with a shorter example and read it, soak yourself in it, just observe it, and ask yourself what you think of as you're going through that process. So I think I might have shared with you a video of mine where I talked about one of Tolstoy's short stories, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. That's a great one to start with because it's relatively short. It's like 40 pages. And it's not heavy-handed. It's just a story of a life of a guy and his death. But just by reading through that, I think anybody would see a number of themes that they would want to explore from having looked at it. What makes this guy stop and think? What makes him reconsider his life? And there's a number of characters. How do they understand his death? How does his wife think of his death, and his daughter think of his death, and his son? And then there's a servant. How does that guy think of his death? So it's interesting to work through, and don't try to get to a lesson. Just try to get to what's presented about reality. Is this real? Is this true? Is this how most of us face death? As opposed to, okay, Tolstoy is trying to make you into Eastern Orthodox Christian.
Right.
I recall Alistair Roberts talking about this when he approaches the scriptures. One of the things I think I asked him once something along the lines of, what questions should you bring to the text? Right. And he said something similar to what you said just now, which is actually, I think the first thing to do is not to bring questions to the text. Yeah. I think it's actually just to sit in front of the text and let it work on you, let it wash over you, and sort of as it were, let the muses smack you around a little bit.
Right. Well, and here's part of the thing is that we can become more or less refined. I think that's what the teacher of art will do, is point out things that you might be missing. Like I've had the experience, I was taken to hear symphonies when I was younger, and then I don't know what's going on. Relatively boring because I have no idea. It's just a lot of sound for 90 minutes. But then as a professor telling you, like, this is what the artist is doing. This is the intro. This is the middle. This is the conflict in the piece. This is the resolution. And you begin to realize the details that are there. It opens up in meaning, and you want to know more and more, because you realize I know 10% now, and it's fascinating. I want to know 50% and 80%. And the same could be true of painting. Rather than approaching a painting like, what's he teaching me? Just observe the painting, and you could be taught. What are painters doing? What school is this? What is happening here? How is it reacting to previous ones? Why is this happening in the painting the way it is? And it starts to open up the meaning of it. And if you just say, well, we need to find the gospel in the Mona Lisa,
all right,
you're missing that stuff.
Yeah. So would you say that art is innately subjective? So we use the phrase a lot in modernity, like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I guess for some, what they could hear you saying is something like, well, encounter the piece of art, and as you encounter it, sort of appreciate it for what it is, get from it what you can. But what you really need is an expert to guide you along the deeper threads that the artist is weaving that you might not be aware of because you're not trained in X, Y, and Z. You haven't had a robust study training in the humanities or the liberal arts or philosophy or architecture or whatever. So is that what you're saying, number one, which I don't think that's what you're saying.
No,
but we'll clarify that, because there could be some people asking that question. And then I guess the second part of that question would be, how is it that Christians could just grab a hold of a piece of art and not automatically import their Christianity into the story, but objectively stand outside of it, recognize these common themes for what they are, and then sort of talk about them in intelligent ways in relationship to their faith? And why is that unique than somebody else? Or is it not unique to a Christian?
And that second question is really what we're driving towards in our whole conversation. Because you brought up earlier archetypes. So we haven't really got there yet. So I'll do the first one, then we'll start to get into those ones. Because I'm not suggesting we need an expert at all. If it's art, you don't need an expert. But we probably know art experts who really, they find their meaning in life and seeing like these little tiny details that no one else saw, and they can write a dissertation on that. So that's not what I'm talking about at all. But by going through a process of like Great Books discussion, which I lead, that process, even with the people who aren't leading it, but as you hear them bringing things out, you're just automatically paying attention to more details in the work. So that's what I was getting at. I don't think it's subjective, because I think art has to rely on, subjective, because I think art has to rely on the objective correlative. It's using signs that speak to all of us. They're not purely culturally bound. Hypothetically, maybe if someone's never been around trees that lose their leaves, they won't get the symbol of the maple leaf. But anybody who has will recognize a similar symbol going on.
Right.
So
it's an in principle.
That's when it's art, is when it gets to objective reality. And that can occur in fantasy, not just realistic fiction, but it has to do that. So that's why I joked around earlier. Like, what if I tell you I'm writing a fantasy series about a tribe of square circles?
Right.
Well, that's clearly not possible. But if it's a couple steps removed from that, it's still a square circle. So that's where the idea of possible worlds comes in. What exactly is a possible world? And is this one a possible world? And a lot of times when the author of those starts to flesh it out, it becomes disappointing. I think most people felt that with the Star Wars series. As soon as you find out that the Force are little things in your blood, it's like, what? That's it? But it's going to be something like that, because it's based on a Taoist model. So it isn't art anymore. It's just Taoist story. And as soon as Lucas starts to flesh it out, we'll find the contradictions that are involved in that kind of dualism.
So is one approach that you might take then, in as much as Christians are sort of looking at art and the kind of gestures toward reality, objective reality, that correlative you're talking about that art makes, that the reason art in its correlative might link up to Christianity just simply has to do with the fact that Christianity is objectively true.
Right.
In other words, go ahead.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that I think for many of us coming to it, we have that assumption in mind. And so then it's very easy for us to say, Gandalf is kind of like Christ. But that's the point I'm pushing on, is to say, no, that's too quick of a jump. Right. Even if Christianity is true, and then it would become circular to use it as an apologetic. Since we know Christianity is true, the things I see as a Christian prove Christianity is true.
Right.
Well,
that's a circular argument, right?
Right.
And at the beginning, you said, well, the Hindu could say the same thing. They have great epics, the longest epic in human history, the Mahabharata. So you can't say epics somehow prove Christianity without doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Nevertheless, there is this phenomenon. Joseph Campbell sort of spent his life exploring this phenomenon. And, the more popular level book, I guess, is Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Joe and I have talked about this before. But he traces out the hero's journey, which I also mentioned in the introduction. And I'm very sympathetic to Campbell's project. But I remember watching your series of Facebook posts on this. And if you don't follow Dr. Anderson on Facebook, you must. He's a wonderful man and lots of great insights. But you really challenged me, maybe even triggered me a little bit in some of your posts. And I'm like, but that made me think, like, this is true. Why is it that I approach, some of these archetypal themes that I find throughout fairy tales and myths and stories and fantasy and whatnot? And how come I reduce it down to Christianity? Is it because I'm a Christian? And I really had to wrestle with that and go, well, yeah, on a real fundamental level, I want whatever contributes to what I believe to be like that is what the intent is. Of course, it lends to what I believe, right? Because I've got it all figured out. And these silly people over there, they just don't have the magic key that unlocks the mystery of the story and opens up their consciousness to receive the gospel, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that I think that the work that you're doing is so fascinating, and it's important. Because a lot of people today, especially in Christian circles, a lot of younger people anyway, I should say, they're picking up on what Jordan Peterson is saying. They're being introduced to archetypes.
Yeah.
And perhaps what they're doing is like making the archetypes carry a load in which they were never designed to carry.
Yeah.
So if they want to use these patterns that they find throughout the world and throughout history in story form, as a means to defend the Christian faith, then that's an appropriate impulse, but we have to be able to do it well. We have to be able to do it better than we have to be able to show why these stories and these archetypes comport better with Christian theology than they do with, as we're saying, like Hindu theology or Buddhist theology or whatever.
Yeah. Or else I would start even a little differently, rather than does this more consistently align with Christian theology? I would start with, what does this say about general revelation?
Yes.
So I think the relationship we understand between those two will affect the way we approach this question. And if I can do a shameless plug, one of my books is titled, just happen to have it right next to me, The Clarity of God's Existence. And I talk about that in there. I talk about the clarity of general revelation in there. In contrast to saying either it's not clear or it's vague. I talk about the general revelation clearly reveals the eternal power and divine nature of God. And if someone doesn't see it, it's not because of the fault of general revelation, it's the fault of themselves, which is precisely then raising the need for redemption. Because you don't see what's clear about God, you're in the state of sin, not seeking God, not understanding, not doing what is right, and you need to be redeemed. So then that opens up a whole new world about redemption,
right,
as well. But redemption presupposes that clarity of general revelation. So I think if we've basically bypassed that segment and we've just gone right to Scripture, then we'll do that same thing with art. We'll look for Scripture in art, and we've lost all the things we can learn from general revelation. So what happens with Peterson, Campbell, of course, is that they're Jungians,
right?
And Jung is not a theist; he's more like a monist, and he's especially all is one. And you tap into the highest reality by a kind of non-cognitive experience. And so Campbell takes that teaching and looks especially at the religious stories of the world and tries to find similarities that match Jung's teaching about the world. So right away, we know this is going in the wrong direction. Even if the general truth, which is that there's patterns, and there's only so many plots, right? There's like 12 plots or something.
Right.
Even if that's true, there's patterns. Campbell's not operating in a vacuum. He's operating as a Jungian. Right. And then Joseph Campbell's looking for the same kind of pattern. So I remember Christians being excited because he was asked, I think by Sam Harris, if he would say that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And Peterson didn't say, he said, no, I can't say that. And Christians were like, yeah. But that's because he's living in this area of archetypes where that's one of the stories, what happens to the hero. He's not talking in the same way that Sam Harris is about history.
Right.
So let's critique this a little bit and see what we can do is do something better. Not because he's a Jungian, drop it all, but instead say, no, there's a clear general revelation about God. And so we'll see certain patterns come out in human history about sin, about the role of suffering. And in fact, I think that's what drives most narratives is the problem of evil. Yeah. Why is there suffering? You're going along just fine, gardening in the Shire, and suffering comes into your life, and you got to do something about it. So think of any story, right? That's what motivates the characters. And there's suffering from moral evil, and there's suffering from natural evil. And so that's a pattern that you'll see all the time going on. That's what happens with Ivan Illich, is he gets sick. And he was going along, getting raises at work. He was hanging some curtains. He got enough money to redecorate his house. He was hanging some curtains, and he slipped and hit his side on the fireplace. And it began hurting more and more. None of the doctors could help him. And so suddenly he begins thinking about his life and the people around him and how superficial they are, because he sees his impending death and how nothing he'd been doing in life actually mattered. Curtains don't matter that much. Yeah. So that's a very natural thing. You don't have to, Tolstoy doesn't have to tell us life is superficial, but he can show it through the life of Ivan Illich. And so that's an objective pattern that people can get to without importing something from the Bible, like Tolstoy halfway through quoting from the Gospel of John or something, because he's dealing with general revelation patterns that speak to everybody.
Yeah. Do you think that there's something of, because this is obviously there's a tricky line sometimes between when you hit the boundary between general and special revelation. And on the one hand, it's very easy to see that stories and narratives and motifs and archetypes have a sort of general revelation significance, like you were just saying. Like they teach you general truths that the sages of the nations can all pick up on, such that Paul can quote them, without being nervous, he's quoting, a pagan philosopher in Acts 17 or whatnot. But you also made another interesting comment, and that is the way I would say it is something like, general revelation can sometimes be almost the negative photocopy of what you anticipate special revelation to need. In other words, sort of like general revelation can show you that you're a sinner.
It's only used for that reason.
Yeah, it doesn't quite show you exactly who and what and where the Redeemer is, but it might, in a sort of negative, in a sort of negative, contrastive way, suggest to you that you need a Redeemer. And I guess the question is, where literature is a little more complicated, is that it can both that sort of negative photocopy space of the imagination can be deployed both to, there's plenty of stories which just sort of come from that existential space of life, or plenty of pieces of art which just come from that existential space of life where we recognized we and everything around us is screwed up or something like that.
Yeah, that's not too hard to do.
But there's also in stories almost like and I wonder if this can still be art, in your definition, like not so much like I'm trying to tell the specific story of the Christ, but I nevertheless detect in this, whatever space we want to call this, some need for redemption. And so I can tell stories that reflect that longing, that hope structure, as it were. And maybe
that's what I'd say, that the reality of the need for redemption is deeply rooted in the human mind, because everyone recognizes something's wrong with the world.
Right.
So then you get different attempts to deal with it. Like the Buddhist might say, overcome desire, and then you'll be okay. Or the Hindu might say, well, ultimately this world's not real.
Right. And there are stories to go with this.
Yeah. Right. They can have their own story. So what I would want to say is that general revelation could have levels from less basic things to more basic things. And the most basic things have to do what's clear about God.
Right.
So if someone knows that 2 + 2 is 4 from general revelation, it's like, hey, great. Everyone knows that. But have you got to the most basic things about the structure of reality? And that's why I'm not very impressed. There's a lot impressive about the work and imagination of the Lord of the Rings and the whole Middle Earth, everything else connected with it. Great. But once we start to flesh out, just like with Star Wars, I'm not all that impressed about what it says about the good, the highest good for humans. Because I would say this, from general revelation, we know that our highest good is to know God. Every human on earth can know that. That was there from the beginning of the world. That's already true before Christ. You should know that. So when I get a structure that is either Gnostic in terms of hierarchies and God is distant, or dualist like Star Wars, there's good and evil and they're both balancing each other out, or monist like Jung, I'm not too impressed with those stories because they're missing a fundamental feature of reality. So what is the highest good for a hobbit? Like to be virtuous, I guess?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And one possibility is that I don't know this because of course there's so many layers to what's going on in Tolkien. Yeah. And on the one hand, it's a commentary. I mean, you could argue it's also a commentary on sort of the international globalist era of the 20th.
I think that's what I said earlier. He doesn't like that.
There's those layers going on, but it might also be along these lines. And I wonder if it's Tolkien and Lewis were so into Owen Barfield and sort of his sort of almost Hegelian history of consciousness. And you wonder if Tolkien is almost like the weird Barfieldian world of original participation.
Yeah, well, I think so. That's what I mean. I think once we flesh this out, we're not going to be happy with what we find. And I think Jung is in that same stream of Hegelianism. Hegel's a monist. All things ultimately reconcile into one. All is one.
Unless
I don't think we'll be. I think if you leave it as an enjoyable, interesting story with characters you like to follow, great. As soon as you start to flesh out, say, no, this gets to the deepest meaning of life.
Yeah, unless you're trying to make a sort of hybrid project, and I think that's where it's like those critiques. Actually, the critiques you're making, I think, make an enormous amount of sense. And I think maybe what's going on in somebody like Lewis and Tolkien is they're trying to almost redeem these structures over against their monism implicitly. Sometimes not, one might say not going far enough, but it seems like sometimes there is and you see this in the same thing with like Till We Have Faces. We talked about this, Andrew Lazo, a couple of weeks ago, that Lewis is kind of trying to imagine how paganism might work in a positive way.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
That's right. That's an uncomfortable space in some ways.
Well, same with Tolkien. Someone could say that, well, what these guys are doing is showing that the pagans got some things.
Yeah.
So this still is about what is general revelation.
Yes.
I think at the fundamental level, all humans, including the pagans, failed to see what's clear about God. They may make other insights, and that's why all humans need redemption. Because if you didn't fail to see what's clear about God, in what sense do you need redemption? So everyone fails with that. Now, the pagans have other insights, like they develop math, the Pythagorean theorem, and architecture. They can be virtuous. I don't know if you realize this, but that was a surprise to medieval Christians to find out there could be virtuous unbelievers.
Right.
Like Suleiman,
it'd be a surprise to modern day Christians too.
What?
Modern day Christians are surprised. Some of them.
Clearly, they can't be virtuous.
Yes.
But virtue, I would define virtue as the means to the good, not the same as the good. So when people tell me about, look, if you look in Middle Earth, you see all these great virtues, like Samwise is very friendly and consistent. Well, that's great, but what is the highest good for him? It seems to be a kind of sentimental, easy life, smoking your pipe and you have a garden. Where's knowing God in any of this stuff?
Yeah, well, you're right that at least I'm not a Tolkien expert, but that's certainly not explicit.
And I don't think you could put it in there because of his view of the God who forms the world. It's not theistic. I think about that. So We Have Faces is like that too. And I wonder about this with Narnia. And keep in mind, I've loved Narnia, read every book when I was in middle school or multiple times. But where's God? Like, does the creation reveal God, or there's only the redemptive work of Aslan? And Still We Have Faces about how God is distant and very difficult to know, and you need to have an experience to know God. That's not the clarity of general revelation.
I think by the end, and Lazo pointed this out, it is interesting. I only noticed it in my second pass through the book, but at the end of Till We Have Faces, God is addressed in the singular, whereas in the rest of the book, the gods are plural. And so there does seem to be an Orwell's sort of spiritual journey, some transition.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the book's a journey.
Yeah, some clarified concept. And there is something, you do get this moment in the magician's nephew of Aslan creating from nothing, which is reminiscent. And it's, though even there, it's not straight up sort of the Old Testament account. It's much more inflected through the logos. It's like it's Aslan. Yeah,
that's what we need to get to today, is the logos.
Yeah,
well, and I don't think Lewis in the Narnia series, he's not trying to present Christian theism as a metaphor, as if like this is just an analogy. Mm-hmm. He's trying to say this is what the gospel would look like in a completely different universe, in a different world. What if there was this world called Narnia, and the savior was a lion?
Yeah.
And the lion was the highest good. So he's not trying to dress up the Christian claims in metaphor. He's playing with a sort of real imaginative interpretation of the cosmos, as if there were different alien worlds that needed redemption, and this is what redemption would look like on that world.
Yeah, you need to understand Narnia. Yeah, like one of the tricks of Narnia, I think, is that the Christian world already exists in Narnia, because you go from here, where Jesus already exists, to Narnia, and it's almost like the medieval. There was, this medieval debate about if we discovered life on other planets, would there need to be other incarnations? Mm-hmm. And Lewis is almost sort of imagining a space somewhere else, where the same, and it's almost like you're almost, I think, in Narnia seeing what he is portraying as in one way, a quite literal world, that is a parallel world to ours. And by getting outside of ours and into this other literal world, you sort of see your own world sort of inflected through it in a different way.
And someone could say, look, don't ruin it. This is why we don't invite philosophers to parties. Right? Just enjoy it for what it is, Anderson. What's your problem? Right. That's true. But we've already entered a different space than art. Right. We're already trying to figure out what was he trying to do. And so if you're right, Dale, what he's trying to do is, what would the gospel look like in another world? That's not quite the same as how he defined art earlier, right? Now he has a motivation. He's trying to do something in this. And so it's more like a moral story or an illustration of something than a piece of art, which is fine. And it's also fine to say to the philosopher, stop thinking about this stuff, just enjoy it. But I wonder, simply like this, like what makes a talking animal's life meaningful in Narnia?
It's a good question.
It's great to be there. It's really magical. But you can imagine ennui setting in, right? And the little talking badgers getting bored with life. What would make their life meaningful? Maybe Aslan might show up in the future.
Well, maybe it's I don't know, because then I feel like you're just going to scream at me and be like, well, stop philosophizing.
No, you can. But I think that's a natural question, especially when you're dealing with characters, is how do they find meaning in life? Like, ultimately, what is Samwise going to find meaning in? He just become this guy who sits around the Shire talking about a story. No one, I was in Mordor.
Right.
Like, hey,
that's absolutely. I think that is a crucial question. It's an interesting question to ask, even of It's a question we have to ask ourselves about the story we tell ourselves about ourselves as well, which it's interesting to me in moral life. In fact, one way to sort of falsify a moral vision or to show its imaginative limits is when you think of a movement like modern progressivism, for instance, I think it's very interesting to ask, like, what if you could have everything you wanted? Right. What would the world actually be like? And I think you actually wind up coming to a place where you're like, that sounds actually kind of boring.
I was talking about it with my students this semester and I was asking them what they think the problems in the world are. And they were saying, well, inequality of income and various other kinds of inequality. I said, all right, let's imagine a world where you have equal income for everyone, equal housing, equal cars, and equal soma. Is your life meaningful? Because now you're just living in Brave New World.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not meaningful.
Yep.
So all those things, if you have equal income, housing, a car, you need soma because life is empty. Right?
Yeah.
We're still kind of circling around the idea of archetypes. When is a story? What is beneficial from a story? Is and behind that, something you raised earlier, Dale, is about apologetic use of a story. Right. So I think once we get to that point of apologetic use, we're outside of art now. And we've incorporated the art for our purposes. And that might also explain, Joe, besides the commercialization, might also explain why some of that Christian work was what it was, because it's really apologetics, it's not art. Those are different kinds of things.
Yeah. And
so
maybe
might say, well, why does Satan get all the great rock stars? But in one level, they're just trying to do rock and roll, right? They're not trying to get you.
Right.
I mean, there is a consistent kind of theme in their stories in rock and roll, but they just want to do the guitar really well.
Right.
I remember there was a Simpsons where the Smashing Pumpkins were on it, and they were talking to Lisa Simpson about their work, and she said, well, great, you make teenagers depressed, right? How hard is that?
Right.
So showing the negative side of life isn't too hard, but showing it well is hard. I think showing the actual emptiness, coming back to the need for meaning in life. And so that rather than say, where does Jesus show up in the Middle Earth stories? Ask that question. I mean, what makes their lives meaningful? Is there any revelation of the glory of God, anything similar to that in their lives that would give them lasting meaning?
Yeah, maybe one way of threading this, toward that apologetic question would be to talk about. So one element that is going on, certainly in Lewis, is the notion of myth becoming fact. And yes. So it's one thing to say sort of like people from different religions or different, religious traditions can kind of look at the same body of stories and garner some of the, either do two things. On the one hand, garner just the very same truths from them, or project their own distinctives into them. Everybody can kind of read their own distinctives into the patterns. But it does seem interesting to suggest that the way in which that's done in Christianity is at least slightly distinctive, in that the way in which it reads itself into those stories is to say that those stories actually became a historical event in some way, or that the kind of ultimate reality that they're illuminating gets repeated in its most archetypal and concrete way in a historical event. Whereas I don't gather this quite the same thing is true in Hinduism and Buddhism, and to some extent even Islam, where the content of the metaphysics and of the faith and of the faiths don't depend in precisely the same way upon on making some claim about an event, between these years in a concrete historical location. And so I wonder if I wonder if you could respond to something like this. It would be funny to maybe reverse Plato. He says the poets tell many a lie, right?
Yeah.
And it would be interesting. Tolkien also uses this language. Will the bad things come untrue? Another question might be, does the actual incarnation of the Christ make the myths unfalse?
Which is good. So, because that came up also in Dale's intro.
Yes.
And briefly, the logos came up earlier, but I think we should return to that, the logos. And I think you're already jumping levels if you go to the logos incarnate. But I think most people are doing that for the reasons we discussed earlier about general revelation. So they want to find a historical fact in the cross, but they're not seeing what made the cross necessary in humans not seeking and not understanding, not doing what is right. How Paul summarizes sin in Romans 3. And so the first temptation, before I go to that, so the logos, I think, first in John 1:1, the eternal Son of God, and then John 1:4, he speaks about it as the light of man. What is this light he's talking about? I mean, not physical light, right?
Right.
And this is before he gets the incarnation. It's way before that.
Right. It's like the illuminating principle or something like that.
I think that's what the word reason means. That by which we understand. And that's what the word logos can mean.
Right.
that very thing by which we understand is what made the world, and the world makes God known. The Logos makes God known. Then he says that the Logos is in the creation. And then he says he came to his own. I take that to mean through the prophets, that's the scriptures.
Mhm.
Then he says, because all those means of Logos were rejected, then he comes incarnate, full of grace and truth. So we don't want to jump levels and go immediately to the incarnation.
Right.
I actually answered a phone call on my computer. I was trying to push delete. What about the Logos' early area? Like I was mentioning the first temptation, thinking about what's being tempted there. And then we can bring up how Jung understands it. God doesn't want you deep because God knows then you'll be like him, knowing good and evil the way God does. So Freud and Jung, and really incidentally the Luciferian tradition, take that to mean Lucifer is the enlightened one. He brings light. And I don't know if you know this, but a lot of times when you look at Masonic, what's it called? The keystones? The cornerstones. Masonic cornerstones will have a date, and it'll say AL. Because they don't date AD, they date Anno Luminous, the year of enlightenment, which was the fall. The year when humans are not to creation, but to the fall of man, which isn't a fall, is when they became enlightened.
Right.
And so I think that's the archetype you're actually seeing are two possible archetypes. We'll call the Luciferian archetype, which is that there is this demiurge. He did make things, but he's a slave master, and he wants to make you into his slave. And freedom is much better than that. You should free yourself from his rule, and I'll teach you how to be free. Of the created beings, I'm the best of the created beings. It's true that God could crush any one of us at any time, but that's just because all he does is uses force. I actually think, and I present you with options. You can then choose yourself. Yes. That's a Luciferian story. And some version of that, you can be as your own gods. And so you'll see that story coming down. That's not the other side of the story, which is that it was clear that they can't be God. They should have known that. As soon as Lucifer said, and you can be like God. No, I'm a creature. I was made by God. I can't be God. And God determines what is good because he's the creator, and I'm not. So I don't determine what's good. He does. And that's the path that leads to understanding why we need redemption.
Right.
So I think a lot of times the archetypes you'll find are that first one. You'll see that's who Prometheus is, right? He defies the evil, mean gods to bring humans enlightenment. He's Lucifer.
Yeah. You'll
see that story over and over. That's the archetype that's interesting to find and see how common it is in human history.
So don't you think that, and I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. Do you think that there's something about the uniformity of just stories in general, though, that by abstraction you can say, okay, because we have all of these stories that are being told that have these general revelation impulses baked into them that extract something out of us, like the world is bad, I'm going to die, what's going to happen to me after I die, I need to do something with all the badness in me. Like those general themes show up in all these different variant art forms, and that phenomenon by itself indicates that humanity is operating in some realm that we all sort of understand our need. We all understand these general patterns, and that is in itself indicative of something bigger than humanity, bigger than this reality. And then when we try to approach that and then say, well, here's why you feel that way, here's why you're noticing those patterns, here's why that general instinct that you have is in you as a human. I think that's really, at least in my own personal experience, that's what I try to do. Like what I ask unbelievers a lot of time is, why is it that you feel so drawn towards these certain stories? Why is it that you resonate so deeply with a hero? Why do you like the fact that the valiant soldier, the knight kills the dragon? Why and gets the girl? Why is that like exciting to you? And then I say, well, this is why. Because we all are trying to overcome evil and
you recognize there is good and evil.
Right.
I think what I bring it to especially is, as I've done a couple times, is the need for meaning. Why do stories that you think provide your life with meaning interest you so much? I mean, that's what's going on, I think, in the Middle Earth. It's fascinating. There's so much to learn about this place. It's really interesting. And that's what happens in these advanced games. The kids play, like, I always joke around, like, I don't know, like remember Halo? Like, my students play Anderson,
which was the best game, by the way. Best game ever made. Best game
right? But they play like Red Dead Redemption, and there's a whole world you can explore. It's fascinating. So I think that taps into our need for meaning. However, I don't think we can actually extend it too far and say everybody, because I don't know if you've ever seen like a Japanese movie not edited for a Western audience, or an Indian movie not edited for a Western audience. Given our background, we think certain things are natural, but when you watch one of those movies, it's like, I don't get why this is interesting or what's happening, because you just don't have that background. It's kind of like soccer, right? You watch it like, oh, what's going on? Back and forth forever. No one's doing anything. Clearly, we should be watching football right now.
Yes, that's right.
I enjoy Russian films, but I have to be in the right mood because they're all very depressing.
So
Joe is the movie
can't go
buff.
too far on that because the way that these stories work out in other cultures makes perfect sense given their background. But for us, we're lost and not to say, well, I don't get what's happening.
Right.
Let me give an example from Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. And he obviously has either comedies or tragedies. And comedy does not mean ha, 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 ha.
Right.
Comedy means it follows Christian history, which means there's a happy outcome. And so you'll see all the comedies have a basic similar structure. There's people introduced, a conflict happens, a bad guy comes into the story, introduces a conflict, and there's a bunch of turmoil. And usually the conflict is based on ignorance that has to be overcome. You find out some things you didn't know, and then you overcome the conflict, and then someone returns, like usually it's a king, returns and sets everything right. And almost every comedy follows that kind of pattern. And the tragedies are the other way. Someone who's virtuous in many ways ends up suffering and losing, and it doesn't seem right. And it's usually occurring in not Christian history. So for example, King Lear is pre-Christian England. Here you have a guy, he overcomes, he realizes his fault, he repents of it, and what happens? He and Cordelia are killed. Like, what? He repented. It's supposed to be a happy ending, but there's no Christ. There's no redemption offered in that world. Even if you did repent and learn lessons, so what?
Yeah.
So that structure makes a lot of sense to us. And we might say, see, the fact of comedies proves Christianity, but it's the other way around. It's because we're steeped in Christianity where we see, that is how history works out. There's a original goodness. There's a conflict introduced. There's a difficult time, and then the king returns and sets it right.
You know, and maybe another way of asking the kind of meta question here would be and that's kind of what we're doing in this podcast, just putting it a number of different ways to see if they extract anything for us. But, I can't help but note that God seems interested in revealing himself to us in this thing that we call life. I think it's worth reflecting on that. It's worth reflecting on that somehow the meaning of being a human is supposed to be something that develops ordinarily at least, over a series of time. You're young, you grow up, you get old, you go through changes, and then the cosmos itself is written in these kinds of rhythms. We talk about seasons and this sort of
I think you're right. General revelation is revelation of God.
Yeah, and I guess the question would be, should we expect a certain kind of, if the Christian gospel, God coming down, if the Christian gospel can be seen as a truth, a historical truth about what God has done with history, the whole story, if you will, should we expect a kind of specially prominent resonance, if you will, sort of fractal pattern, if you will, that sort of extends through, we can look at the self as a coherent story. We can look at the story of our family or of a nation or of all people as a coherent story. And there are sort of threads that singularly.
That's the logos, right?
What?
That's the logos, right? The intelligibility.
Yeah. There are threads that singularly illuminate all through those same things. And I wonder if maybe one way of framing this would be to say, that maybe it wouldn't be surprising if the particular content of the Christian gospel illuminates the rest of those threads in a particular way just because it's true. It participates in the same logos, know.
Sure. Absolutely. I think that does happen. The problem is if it becomes a circle if you use it for apologetics.
Right, the immediate proof.
This reflects it, therefore Christianity is true.
Yeah, it's not this side of things is the it's the bonus in a sense.
But what I'm also cautioning about though is what I call jumping levels. So that you go right to the incarnation.
Right.
And you've not really, it's not just because of the importance of the cross, but it's really because you've downplayed in your own life what you can know from general revelation. So I call it the minimalist view, or what you brought up earlier, the holding people accountable view. Like general revelation just makes you inexcusable, but then you need the incarnation to know God. It's like, no, the creation reveals God, and all of the glory of God is seen there, and we're to know that. And the fact that we don't know that is one of the reasons why we need redemption.
Right. So what you're saying is basically the monomyth that's baked into the fabric of reality that we're all trying to interpret. We're all trying to interpret general revelation. It sort of manifests itself in various idolatries, and it's not general revelation is not explicit enough for us to say your idolatry is wrong. I got it correct. Here's the correct thing. It's the incarnation. That's basically what you're trying to say, that we're all.
I think you could say, I think general revelation reveals that what it means when it says they suppress the truth,
right,
is not a kind of they know and they hide it, but they suppress it by teaching falsehoods. So instead of thinking of it in terms of the inner psychology of the suppressor, think of it as the objective truth. They put something else in the place of God. So for Aristotle, it's this unmoved mover.
Right.
And I think you could show from general revelation that Aristotle is wrong about that. And for Plato, it's the demiurge. I think you could show from general revelation that Plato's wrong about that. I think that we get an example in Acts 17 of going down that road. He doesn't quote the Old Testament, right? You could just, from general revelation, you can know the Epicureans and the Stoics are wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we should be encouraging people, challenging Christians to do, because I think it would end up in better art, but it also avoid this kind of circles in apologetics.
Right.
And so think about Jordan Peterson. He's exciting because he's reminding us of take responsibility for yourself. Stop blaming everyone else. Learn how to do things.
Right.
And that's appealing. There's no doubt about that. You have latent powers in you that you can learn skills, and you can clean your room, get a job, have a paycheck, pay your bills, right? Just basic things that we maybe thought we didn't have to teach people. So those are great. But if we leave it there, we'll call those virtues. If we leave it there, that life can also be empty. And you can have a very capable person who knows lots of things,
right?
And their life is empty. And I don't know what's going on with Jordan Peterson, but it seems like he struggles with this kind of existential stuff. His own philosophy is not helping him with these things.
Yeah, there's a moralism that sort of takes over that I think you're wanting to guard against people just sort of going down this moralistic therapeutic deism, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah, good.
Right. But I do think that Christianity, I think that all of the things, all of the patterns, everything that we're talking about, and as we sort of start to wrap up a little bit here, I think that all of the patterns, everything that we see, I do think that Christianity, as Joe was saying earlier, brings all of these stories into the concrete via incarnation. And what you're helping me think through is, well, we can't just leap there, right? So we can't just sort of take these general patterns and then run to the incarnation and say, that's the concrete example of all of these myths, and they become fact via incarnation. But I do think that because we are reasonable souls and God has made us in his image, and his fingerprints are all over creation, and everything testifies to him. Psalm 19, Romans 1, Romans 2, the law of God is written on our hearts, that we're sort of groping in the dark, and we're pulling at things that are instinctively built in us to want to run towards the good. Aristotle, in the first sentence of his Ethics, says this, right? All inquiries, all thoughts, all propositions, I think, point to some good,
some highest end,
some highest good, highest end. And then our passions get in the way because we're broken and we're sinners. And so we distort that, right? Our desires run away from us, and we grab onto other things that are, bent. But we are all moving in the direction of the good in some capacity. And I think that's the appeal of art to Christians when they use it in an apologetic method, is that we're just simply pointing to that. And we're saying, why? Why do we all do this? There's got to be a reason.
Because you're right, we've noticed things like good and evil in art, conflict, struggle to pursue what is good and overcome evil in our lives or in a society. So there are those patterns there, but I would have a caveat to say this. I don't think everyone is struggling toward the good. I know Aristotle says that, and I agree with him. There is a highest end, but I think what we'll find out is that no one is seeking.
Yeah, well,
and we try to blame something else. This is why we like Jordan Peterson. Take responsibility for yourself.
Yeah.
You're not seeking God. You lie to yourself and you tell yourself you are, and you try to lie to others and tell them that you are, but no one is seeking God. Yeah. And everyone's in this condition of not pursuing God.
Yeah.
Even though that's our highest good. So that's part of the question mark of human.
Yeah. A synthesizing way to put it might be that you're seeking the good under the guise of an idol, under the face of an idol. So it's
I think that's what the Logos does, is the Logos exposes that. And it doesn't allow us to continue to live as if idols are meaningful. Now, that may not get us to Christ, but it gets us to the emptiness of what we have. And the way you know that someone's life is empty is because they go to excess, which we always see with idolatry.
Well, and you wonder if this is the other. So this will be because we're going to wrap it up here, as Dale just said, but maybe this is a final way to sort of couch it. Is that you have this instance where, for instance, you could think of a plausible narrative where it's interesting that religion, for instance, ancient, sort of ancient Near Eastern religion, the universality of the theme of human sacrifice, is so sort of distributed among the nations, just the notion of sacrifice. And we could come up with sort of things in general revelation that might account for why did human beings ever develop the instinct or receive a tradition of sacrifice.
Something else.
One of the church fathers' narratives there, of course, is that this is actually a human instinct. It's something that we recognize, but it was distorted by sinister spiritual agents, right? Mm-hmm. That it's sort of, maybe there's some demonic influence even in sort of the, and I wonder if there's
that's that Luciferian branch I was talking about.
Right. What?
That's that Luciferian branch I was talking about.
Yes. And I wonder if there's another way of talking about stories here, that you could say something like, because God is making this history, this particular narrative, this particular story, this is the story of humanity in Christ is the story he's always been going to tell.
Right.
And so the language of the imagination and of the cosmos itself from that same logos, from that same creator, is written there. But part of what idolatry does is take the architecture and the components of that story and then recombine them in ways that tell something fundamentally different. So all of a sudden, this theme of sacrifice, which in Christ is actually going to become this pure, beautiful, holy thing, in South America, under the reign of an Aztec Empire, is the most heinous, bloodthirsty. It's just it's hundreds of thousands of people. This sort of thing.
I think so. But I think once you establish Christianity, then I think we have a story about how this stuff happened, right? There's remembrances back to Babel, at least, when the nations were dispersed and they had a common culture. And before that, there's remembrances probably back to Cain and Abel. So I think you end up seeing there's two branches of what a sacrifice is, the Cain branch and the Abel branch. And the idea, we have an immediate sense maybe that the world is not as it should be, although I think we tend to view ourselves as doing really well and the world's broken, but I'm doing great. So that's why I love A Christmas Carol, because I think that shows what does it take to come to realize you're not doing good at all?
Yeah.
Right.
And ultimately, he's confronted with his own mortality.
Yeah.
So as a side note, just to say, it takes a lot. The whole story takes to get Scrooge to the point of just admitting. There's at one point where he says, okay, maybe I've been doing some wrong things, but basically I'm a good person. It's like, no, that's not enough. You have to go further. You're not basically a good person.
Right.
So I think that story is there. And once we have Christianity, we might give some explanation of the nations being divided, et cetera, that explains this original awareness of that story. But then you're right. You get some sense that since I need to be saved, I can't do it. Someone else has to.
Right.
Yes.
And so then you get a story of Osiris or whoever it is. They'll come and save me. even though then I think once you start exploring them, you'll see that these are more like the Luciferian examples of the light bearer coming to save you from. So what are you being saved from, and by who matters a lot.
The convenient misidentification of our true problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, and we have our, and the other reason it's interesting to talk about myth motifs this way is, of course, we have our own versions of them. Our own.
Not me, Joe.
Mark. Well, except for Dale, of course.
Right.
But Marx and Freud. What's so fascinating to me in 19th century thought, when you read Marx or Freud or Nietzsche or Durkheim, all these people. I was just telling Dale actually this today. I think that they all have a version of the Adam and Eve story. Yep. They all have their primal Rousseau. They all have this.
Well, Freud's very explicit of taking the side of the serpent.
Yes,
and Marx doesn't have that, I don't think. Well, I've heard people have told me that Marx was a Satanist in a literal sense. I'm talking about Luciferianism as a kind of a story, not.
Yeah.
But I've heard people say, no, Marx was Satanist. All right, they say they have his journals. I don't know, but I think this is true. I've heard him called a Christian heretic for this reason. Right. He takes that story of conflict and redemption and makes it just material.
Right. I was being a child of sort of 90s evangelicalism during the height of the satanic scare. Of course, one of the ways that you really freak people out about Saul Alinsky is that Rules for Radicals was, dedicated to Lucifer.
That's that's a good example. He means Lucifer in the sense I was using it, not.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Is that I think that's not quite what he's.
That's the other side of finding the gospel is finding Satan in.
Right.
So why is Marx wrong? He's a Satanist, right?
Yeah.
Why is Lord of the Rings good? It's the gospel.
Yeah. And I think, and we are going to wrap up now because we could go forever, gentlemen.
That's right.
We'll have to do it again because this has been a good conversation.
Yes. And we'll have more. But I think on a real fundamental basic level, you are correct that if we're trying to bridge the gap, so to speak, then what we do need at the end of the day is special revelation. We need God's revelation in the scriptures to tell us exactly how we resolve our problems that we innately understand. We have an impulse to believe in God because what can be known of God is clearly revealed, his eternal Godhead and power. We recognize that his law is written on our heart. Our conscience condemns us when we do something evil. We feel our own mortality. The world is wicked. We're going to die. What do we do after that? We need redemption. And redemption only comes through the Messiah, the Christ.
And not general revelation, but I don't think you can get redemptive knowledge from general revelation.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Knowledge assumes general revelation.
Yes, precisely. You need special revelation for redemption.
Yeah.
That's just true. So what we've come to understand is Dr. Anderson hates literature, hates art.
He hates this. No, I don't.
Right. Well, thank you, brother. It was a pleasure to have you on, and we will definitely do it again. Very, very stimulating conversation. But as always, everyone out there, you can find us at davenintinstitute.org, and this will be on the Davenant Institute YouTube page. Please head over to Dr. Anderson. I think you have your own website, owenanderson.com.
My YouTube name is just Dr. Owen Anderson. So,
and you also have a website dedicated.
DrOwenAnderson.com also.
Right, DrAnderson.com, and we'll link to that, Joe. Remind me when we get off the call, and I'll shoot you the link. But we also have a Facebook group, so you can go to facebook.com/Pilgrim Faith group, and we also have a Facebook page. If you guys find this edifying, we're also supported by our listeners, so if you'd like to donate, there'll be a button on our page on davenintinstitute.org. But we thank you all for listening. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Joe, I love you, brother.
Love you too, man.
And Dr. Anderson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All
right, guys, see ya.
Okay. All right.